Hello and welcome to Your HR Career Podcast. Continuing in my series talking to interesting HR people, I'm interviewing the very lovely Sarah Darbyshire. Hello, it's good morning for us, but hello and welcome, Sarah.
Good morning, Jane. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, you too. So Sarah is an HR consultant, and we'll learn more about her journey through our HR and how she ended up where she is. And as with all the other people I'm interviewing, I've shared a set of questions with them. So you'll hear me referring to those as we go through the conversation. But let's start at the beginning. How did you get into HR, Sarah? Tell us all about it.
Okay. So my HR career started in 1995 when I went to work for a small family business in Leeds. They were a recruitment company and they were supporting large blue chip companies, Shell, BP, Nestle, Mars and so on. And it was quite a small team at the time, made up of several recruitment consultants, and each of them had their own secretary or PA. And my job initially was looking after two of the directors, and I also ran the office, so I was the office manager. To be honest, when I'd graduated in 93, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So I'd done some work in customer service jobs in banking, but that wasn't really for me, if I'm honest. I found it quite restricted. But what I found was I was really good at the organisation side of the job, letter writing for the financial advisors. And so I spoke to a couple of friends and I actually went and did a secretarial course because back then you needed qualifications to get a job as a secretary or a PA. And then I got a job at the recruitment company through a friend of a friend. And she'd worked at this business and she'd also recommended I went to college as well. So she was quite important in me moving into HR. I loved working at the recruitment company because it was very different to working in financial services. But what we found as the business grew was that staff turnover, particularly amongst the support staff, was very high. It was running about 45%.
Yeah.
So because by this point, I was one of the more experienced PAs, I was spending a lot of time training new staff, settling them in, and then finding that they weren't staying. And I wasn't involved in recruitment at that stage, but what I was finding was that we were selling the job to candidates, but there was a mismatch between their expectations and what the job actually involved. Because
they were in sales, weren't they? So they were going to sell it well, weren't they? Yeah, but perhaps oversold then. Yeah,
exactly. So we were getting people who were graduates, but they wanted to progress. They were, they got their eyes on the recruitment consultant role, or they wanted to progress somewhere else. What we actually needed and what I changed it to was we needed people with different expectations. So maybe A-level school leavers. So they've got a good level of education, because obviously things like being able to put together a good letter and communication skills were important. But their aspirations were different to graduates or people who'd been career PAs. And as we started to do that, and I got more involved in the recruitment side of things, turnover dropped significantly down to about 10%, which was a healthy level of staff turnover, but not as high as it's been, obviously. And then as the business, sorry, go on.
And what point did it become more of an HR role? So you're very much interested in business, good at admin, getting stuff sorted, but starting to notice that there are things about the way the employees, the way the people are behaving that could be improved, as you said, with improvements. So at what point did that role become HR, or did it become a full HR role?
It didn't become completely full HR, if I'm honest, because it was an evolution. So as a business grows, as we know, that there are more people and therefore there are more potential HR issues to resolve, to deal with. Yeah. So I started getting more involved in things like employee relations issues and developing some policies and procedures and looking at, things like culture. And the business actually supported me to do my CIPD qualification.
Okay.
So that was really helpful as well. So as I was learning, I could put things in place, but it was also quite challenging because I was one of a couple of people, I would say, who weren't actually working in HR at the time while studying that qualification.
Yeah. And where did you do your studying?
Leeds Metropolitan University.
Yeah. And so in that classroom, there's a whole range of people then, aren't there? Really experienced people with big HR roles, and then there will be a few people who are just starting out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it was good because I could learn from the people that were much older than me, much more experienced than me. but I also recognised that it was more challenging for me because I hadn't got that experience to put into things like assignments, or, you know, when we're having discussions in class, I didn't have actual scenarios that I could relate what we were learning from.
Yeah, absolutely. But presume there was something within that interested you, so you kind of naturally moved towards that within the business, because you could have ended up being more accounts, couldn't you, potentially? Yes. You know, from an office manager role. So once you've kind of seen a bit, you've been involved in some ER, you're thinking about recruitment, you're in your CIPD seminars, what is it about HR at that point that interested you, that you thought, yeah, I think this is right for me?
I'd done a little bit of personnel, as it still was back then,
Yeah.
in my degree. So I'd done a management degree with a little bit of personnel, and probably touched on a bit of employment law, which had interested me because I've always been interested in people and what makes people tick. But it almost felt quite natural, you know, just to look at the way that we were recruiting people and the fact that they weren't staying. There was a curiosity, I suppose, Jane, in terms of why aren't people staying? What are we doing?
Yeah.
In terms of,
so it's that behaviour question,
yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so,
Fantastic.
definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And I like the
variety
as well.
So we've got a sense then of you as this sort of embryonic, interested in business, interested in people, and starting out on your CIPD. I want to move you forward. You gave me a really interesting example around the challenge of working in HR. So you were talking about working for a charity which had never had HR, and you were younger than many of the managers and the staff and the volunteers. And there was a real challenge about, do I know what I'm doing? What are my qualifications? You sort of alluded to that. Talk to me about that, because I'm really interested in kind of some of these really thorny issues that we often don't talk about as an HR community, about kind of what people's expectations are and kind of how you handle that when you're dumped in it as the only person, presumably in HR, and also a young person. You know, that's tough early on in your career. So talk to us about how you manage that. What was the issue and how did you manage it?
Okay, so as you say, it was a charity, and I'd been looking for a role, and I wanted to make my own mark on a business, I suppose. So I went there because it was a greenfield site, basically, which appealed to me at that point in my career. Probably been in HR about 8 years at that point, you know, including the recruitment where it had transitioned. But yeah, when I first started, as you said, a number of the managers had no issue with kind of challenging me it was almost daily to start with, in terms of, you know, did I know what I was doing, and
would they actually say it that plainly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what qualifications did I have? Why was I in this job? What experience had I got? Which, as I said in my notes, I think I would deal with that differently now. I don't think I would you know, respond in the way that I did, but I was probably early 30s.
How did you respond at the time?
I think I tried to stay calm, and I explained that I'd been working in HR and recruitment since 1995. I'd got the qualification. This is what my background was. I'd done a couple of years working for a consultancy firm, so I'd been dealing with lots of different businesses, answering lots of questions on the hoof, because it was a helpline, so people would ring up and I didn't know what question I was going to get. So that would have been a really good grounding, actually, in terms of questions being thrown at you and having to find the answer. So yeah, and I think over time, because there were a lot of issues when I first went in there, it was, you know, we often see this in HR, I think, where you go into a business and managers haven't been trained. They've grown up in the organisation, but they've not been trained. So they were doing the best, but they hadn't dealt with what they felt were difficult issues. So of course they were just festering. And
absolutely,
as the new HR manager, of course, I went in and looked at these issues and started to manage them. And so because I was doing that, and I was writing policies, because there was literally nothing, and training the managers and then coaching the managers through scenarios, I proved I knew what I was doing, I guess.
So you kind of showed them your credentials, as it were, but then just got on with the job and showed them that you were moving things in the right direction. And how do you think you would deal with it differently now?
I think now, I mean, I don't tend to get those, you know, going in as a consultant, you don't tend to get those challenges, because people accept that, you know, they recognise that I'm doing this job because I know what I'm doing. I've got a lot of experience and so on. So It doesn't tend to come up these days. I mean, that's a really good question. But
so what advice would you give to Liv, there'll be people listening to this who are early on in their career. So kind of what advice would you give them if they were going into that kind of role?
I think, accept that people don't understand what HR is, because that was another challenge I found, that people didn't know what personnel was, or in that sector didn't really see at the time, we're going back a long time now, but didn't really see why they needed a personnel manager or a HR manager. So I think it's going right back to basics and explaining what the purpose of your role is. I think what I would do differently now, which I have done in subsequent roles actually, is set up meetings early doors with the key managers to introduce myself, to explain what my role is and my remit and how I'm there to support them and guide them.
I think that's really nice, isn't it? Set your stall out early.
Because I think another thing as well, Jane, was there was an expectation that, you're the personnel manager, you've come to manage all the staff. Well, nobody could physically manage 100 staff and however many volunteers we had. That wasn't possible, but they thought that was my job. Once I'd kind of prove myself and explain what I was there to do, it was then, right, you can deal with all the staff and we can get on with our day jobs. So again, there was an education piece there. So
and again, it's that manager's hope / expectation, that somebody's going to fix it and it doesn't have to be them.
Exactly.
And that's an ongoing friction, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think for somebody testing out and starting out as well, I think it's a test of character, it's resilience in terms of being challenged and being comfortable that this is what I'm here to do, being clear on what your role is as well.
Excellent. And I've asked quite a few people about what the role was that they wish they hadn't taken. Quite a few people have shied away from that, but I'm very pleased to say that you haven't, Sarah. You got stuck in. So let me ask you a couple of questions about that. I think I always find it fascinating to see people who are successful, kind of which bits were slight detours or wrong turns or cul-de-sacs you wish you hadn't gone down, because it kind of shows that even if we make a bad decision, it isn't the end of the world. Our careers are not over. There's something that can be gained from it. So tell me what was the mismatch? What was wrong about the role?
Okay, so just to give a little bit of context, if that's okay. So I'd been in a head of HR role, and that role was made redundant. And at the time, this was 2010, that level of job just disappeared overnight. So I think there were a lot of senior people on the market struggling to find a job at the level they've been operating at. And so we were going for jobs that were a step backwards, if you will. So I ended up taking a couple of interim roles. And the role that was a mismatch was a specialist role. So I'd always been a generalist, and this job really reinforced that I am a generalist because I like the variety. You asked me earlier what I like about HR, and one of the things is the variety in it. So the business that I went to work for had the Ulrich model of HR. So they had a shared service centre where some of the functions like training, recruitment, reward, employee relations were central. And they were providing a service to the business units, which had HR business partners on the ground dealing with the managers. And part of the reason I took the role was that there was an opportunity potentially for me to move into a HR BP role. That was kind of part of the conversation at the interview. But being honest, it became apparent quite quickly that the role wasn't a fit for me because I'm not a specialist. I was looking after things like policy work, which, if I'm honest, is not my passion.
It's fine.
People, exactly. So some people, that's what they love doing. There was a job evaluation panel that I was involved in chairing. So reward is not my area of expertise. The employee relations side of things I loved. I've always enjoyed that, and I still do to this day. The challenge of, sorting out issues and finding a resolution, I enjoyed that. And I also learned a lot from dealing with 3 recognised unions. That was a really good element of the role. And also I would go to the senior HR teams, like board meetings almost, and do presentations and provide information on project work that was going on, policy updates, etc. So I learned quite a lot from that around stakeholder engagement as well. So it definitely wasn't wasted, because I don't think any experience is a waste. It was just, I felt like a square peg in a round hole, because I wanted to be on the ground, dealing with the managers, dealing with the employees, providing that support that I provided in every other role. And
that,
I didn't feel
that's one of those challenges, isn't it, around, you know, kind of knowing where your preference lies.
Yeah.
And I think also sometimes that's linked to the size of the organisation. So I'm guessing this organisation was large.
Yes.
That it had the opportunity to have that Ulrich model. And I think often when people are thinking about their careers, it's thinking about the size of the organisation and kind of what challenge that presents, because it is different, isn't it? It's not just sector based, it is also size based. So I think that's an interesting thought, isn't it, to think that you have a preference for generalists. So you're either going to find that as a BP in a big business, or you might stay in a smaller business where you get to do a little bit of everything.
Yes.
Yeah, you can probably tolerate a little bit of, you know, an annual pay review, but, you know, not much more, you know, just little bits of it. So I think that's interesting, is it, for people to reflect. And do you think, were you surprised about that? Or did you kind of know you weren't a specialist, but you needed a job? It looked like it might lead to something, you thought you'd give it a go?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'd always been a generalist in SMEs. You know, so I'd always worked with a workforce of 250 and under in terms of numbers. So yeah, part of it was I needed a job, but I could see the opportunities, and I hadn't worked in such a large organisation in HR either. So it was, and that's another point actually, Jane, because when I'd worked either as a sole practitioner or my role in the charity, I'd eventually recruited somebody, or in my head of HR role, I'd had a small team. That's very different to being part of a bigger team where you've actually got peers. So people where you can have, you know, and that works. So everybody, like you say, everybody's different. You know, I have always steered my own ship and preferred to steer my own ship, I guess. But I did enjoy having peers as well. So I think for somebody starting out is think about what support do you need, because some people like to have that group around them, those team members. You know, I enjoyed that, but I also liked having the independence of being a head of HR or running a function or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. Yeah, thinking about, because that's a different angle, isn't it, of thinking about how you can excel in a role. As you say, some people have that confidence early on, don't they, that they can do it themselves and might take a standalone or a setup role.
Yeah.
And then other people want to be part of a larger team. Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, really interesting. So tell me, I ask everyone this, and I think it's interesting to reflect, those of us who've worked in HR for a while, kind of what advice we would give someone starting out in their HR career.
So I mentioned earlier about the curiosity in terms of why were people leaving the recruitment company, for example. So I think being curious is really important, and willing to learn and find things out for yourself. Even now, there are questions that I get where I don't know the answer, but I can research them, you know, or I can ask one of my peers, that sort of thing. So I think it's also important to remember that HR is about dealing with people, which might sound obvious. But I think sometimes people get a bit hung up on rules or policies. And again, particularly at the start of your career, because it's, you know, that you're learning. So that's the default in terms of the policy says X, Y, and Z. But there isn't always a policy for some of the situations that we manage, that we're guiding people through. So I think that's one thing in terms of, being curious, remembering there's a person at the centre of whatever situation it is that we're dealing with. Because although I did my CIPD quite early on, it didn't actually teach me how to do things like run a disciplinary, work with a trade union, deal with a sensitive issue where maybe somebody's got mental health issues. And so I've had to kind of feel my way and throw myself into situations. Some of it is intuitive. Obviously, we've got employment legislation that we need to comply with, but you need that balance, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. Yeah, and I think I absolutely agree with you that early on in our careers, we're kind of holding on to the policy handbook like a life raft, aren't we?
Yeah.
That it's going to give us all the answers. And then as we develop into it, we realise that things are actually a bit greyer than that. And when we're dealing with people, each one is unique, isn't it? And you have to be, I think that real sort of emotional intelligence that and the intuition. I've heard quite a few HR people say they're good judges of character. They have that kind of natural intuition.
Yes.
I think that can often be sort of hidden behind in the natural personality of people who excel in HR. So I think, yeah, absolutely excellent advice. Good. Right. Well, we have time for one last question. So let me ask you, where are you now and what is next for you?
Okay. So I've been running HR Solutions Yorkshire since 2016. So I'm coming up to 10 years next year.
Right. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I really love the variety and flexibility of running my own business. So my focus at the moment is on HR strategy, board advisory work, such as attending client board meetings and subcommittee meetings, management development, employee relations, and also change management. So things like restructures, TUPE transfers, and so on. I am looking to develop my experience and looking to take on a couple of paid board roles over the next year or so. To develop my experience in this area, because I've worked in lots of different sectors and I feel I can use that experience to contribute at a high level of the organisation.
And any particular sectors you're looking for those board positions, just in case people are listening?
I'm quite open, to be honest. I mean, my background was not sector specific. As a consultant, I work in lots of different sectors, so I'm really open. I think it's more about the opportunity and the challenge, because a lot of my roles have been about making change, making improvements, efficiencies, and so on. So I think as a board advisor, as a board member, you've got that oversight, and obviously bring your experience and your knowledge to help that business progress.
Brilliant. Well, you never know, somebody might be listening who's after wise counsel, so you'll be able to contact Sarah. So thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed learning more about your experience. You know, we've sort of crossed paths a few times, but I didn't really know much about your background, so I found it really, really interesting. And I think some really wise and sensible advice for HR people in their careers. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your time. And thank you, everybody, for listening. You can find other episodes of Your HR Career podcast over on my Substack page. And if you'd like to get early access and some behind the scenes content, do please sign up to my newsletter. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks again, Sarah. See you soon.